Okay, so welcome everybody to this research seminar with Daniel Lindvall, who is a researcher here at the Institute for Future Studies, which I'm very happy about. Also at the Uppsala University Climate Change Leadership Institute at the Department of Earth Sciences in Uppsala. And Daniel got his PhD in sociology from Stockholm University in 2010 with a dissertation entitled The Limits of European Vision in Bosnia and Herzegovina, an analysis of police reform negotiations, which is quite a distance from what you're going to talk today, I think, but one can expand. Anyway, so you have written quite a lot about, and been thinking about climate and energy transition and how democratic governments respond to climate crisis. And you present about that, but you also have quite extensive experience. It's very fitting being here with the Swedish government, serving as the principal secretary for the government inquiries like the 2014 Democracy Commission. And I guess because of your earlier work, you spent quite a lot of time in Bosnia and Herzegovina, working for the European Union and the Office for the High Representative. But today, we were going to talk about, will democracy withstand the climate crisis? A quite difficult topic, but I'm looking forward. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Gustav. Thank you. Really pleased to be here to talk about this issue. As Gustav said, I worked for the government for a while on democracy policies, and especially when we did the democracy inquiry, I came across this issue of, okay, so climate change. What kind of challenges is climate change imposing on democracy? And I couldn't really let go of that issue, and it's really the topic that brought me back to research. Eventually, I'm really happy to be able to do it here at the institute, and it's been a couple of publications over the year. And 2 years ago, I had a chance to write a book for the Routledge. Research on global environment and governments, and the topic I was supposed to write about was how can democracy cope with climate change, and how can we develop the institutions in order to make democracy more fit for this challenge. But and I thought I would write just an introductory chapter on how climate change as such, like extreme weather events and so on, how that can affect the democratic governance. And it ended out in the end. The whole book is about that topic. So what do I mean when I speak about climate change and the challenge of democracy? What basically the provocation I'm making is that climate change and the consequences of climate change is the greatest challenge that modern democracy has ever faced. And when I'm saying democracy, I'm talking about a system of governance which is based on fair and open elections and the rule of law, and which respects the fundamental principles of civil rights, especially freedom of association, freedom of speech. And while I'm saying it's challenged, I'm not saying that research is settled. I'm saying that these events, like different climate impacts, will have political consequences. Whether it will affect democracies in a negative direction, or in some cases actually open up for change in a more positive direction, that's not really clear. And I might not bring a full answer to that, but I'm going to present some of the research on these events. So let me just start by going back in history. So about 95 years ago, outside of Cape Verde, the hurricane Zanzeman was formed out of the perfect conditions of cold and hot temperature. It traveled across the Atlantic, and it grew up to a category 5 on the Saffir-Simpson scale, and it made landfall on the Dominican Republic on the 3rd of September. So Dominican Republic at the time, very poor country. It's basically the city Santo Domingo, which was hit directly by the hurricane, was a city of mainly wooden construction, wooden houses. And during that night, basically the whole city was destroyed. Farmlands flooded, roads destroyed, as reported in the Associated Press. There was scarcely a wreck of a wall standing. More than 1,000 people died instantly. So the Dominican Republic at the time was also going through a kind of transformative process. It was burdened by debts and it's been under US occupation for several years, but in 1924 it regained independence and started this kind of treating towards some kind of democratic consolidation. But it was a fragile state, and in 1930, that summer, just before the hurricane struck, this guy, Rafael Trujillo, he assumed power through coup, and he announced elections, but the elections were quite rigged, so he managed to grip power. But still, the country was still quite fragile. The opposition was quite strong, and just a few weeks after that event, Hurricane Zanzeman struck the Dominican Republic. So this disaster proved to be a game changer for the whole country. So with an iron fist, Trujillo directed the army to take care of the relief efforts. He distributed food, medicine, and other essentials. At the same time, he disbanded the government, the parliament. He announced basically a situation where all the parties were disbanded. He used the situation to arrest all the opposition, killed some of his enemies, and form a completely new type of governance. A kind of brutal regime emerged. If you have read Mario Vargas La Fiesta de Chevo, you get the full details of the last days of Trujillo's dictatorship. Some refer to Trujillo as as a storm autocrat, an autocrat that basically funded his autocratic rule out of an event of a disaster. So you might ask yourself, while we're entering into a time when we will see more severe hurricanes, are we entering into an area of increasing storm autocrats? Well, hurricanes, for the matter, I mean, especially Zanzeman was not caused by climate change, and hurricanes will not become, seemingly not become more frequent, but they become more severe. Over the last 3 decades, we can see that the probability of a 3 to 5 scale hurricane has increased by 8 to 10% for every decade. But hurricanes is of course not the only type of extreme events that have become more frequent. The World Meteorological Organization recorded about 3 times as many extreme weather events over the last 3 decades, and unfortunately the situation becoming much worse. Heat waves, for instance, that are predicted to occur once every 100 years are, according to the IPCC's report from 2021, forecasted to happen once every 4 years. This will cause more droughts to happen and other extreme events like flooding, on the other hand. Well, we are entering into more turbulent time. How turbulent it will be, of course, difficult to say. These are from the UNEP Mission Gap report that's calculated the predicted warming, depending on the current policies and the NDCs, the natural determined contributions. So what's basically the climate policy actions that different countries are reporting into the UN system. So right now it seems like we're heading towards just under 3 degrees. It's most likely. Of course, this is very there's a high uncertainty associated with these figures, not only because climate models are not fully accurate, but also because climate policies might be sped up or even obstructed. So, but still, we can say one thing: 2.8 is much better than the predictions were like 10 years ago, just after the Paris agreements. We've gone actually to more optimistic scenario. Still, 2.8 is a quite horrific scenario. 2.8 is a warming that could trigger tipping points that could self-enforce the climate crisis to become even worse. And these, and even if we go down to say 2.3, we will still see warming that will have tremendous implications for ecosystem, social systems, economic systems, but also the system of democracy. And now, if we see over the last 15 years, we've seen this kind of record years with record warming constantly. But over this time, we've also seen a constant decline in freedom. This is from the American US organization Freedom House that recorded now 19 years of global decline in freedom. This is also, we can also see that from other types of organizations like the VDEM Institute in Gothenburg in 2002. They reported that 42 countries were heading towards a more positive development of democracy, while 13 were heading in the opposite direction. 20 years later, those figures were completely the opposite. Now, what I'm saying here is not that there are direct correlations between these two graphs. That's so heating is causing democracy to decline, or the decline of democracy is the result of heating is because of the decline of democracy. But I would say, and that's also what I'm going to discuss, that in the future, I would say that these two trends will interact with each other to a larger extent. And of course, this is concerning, since of course democracy in general, I mean, it's based on, I mean, we need to think about the inherent values of democracy. It's based on some moral principles that I think we as an enlightened civilization should strive for. But there's also an instrumental value from a climate policy perspective. There are good reasons to believe that democracies are more fit to deal with the complexity of climate change. I did a literature review that we published in Climate Policy, where we went through 72 different studies or correlations between sort of democracy index and climate policy output, so regulations and policies, and emission data. And we could see when it comes to adopting climate policies, democracies are much better, while emissions, of course, is more difficult. I'm not going to go into these graphs, but basically it shows that, well, democracies, if you look at democracies that are at the same level of economic standards, or different countries of same economic standards, democracies are faring much, are being much better when it comes to regulating or curbing emission, while autocracies are faring much worse. I mean, if we do have doubts...
Sorry, if you can clarify, you're mixing different language here. Adopting and implementing?
Yeah, so this is basically adopting policies, legislations, and targets. Democracies are clearly much better. When it comes to the impact, so basically, if we look at the scores of emission, how different countries, the emissions, here we can see emissions now of different, not only CO2, but other pollutants. There are other factors involved, so we can't really isolate the system of governance and say that democracies are cleaner in that perspective, because many countries that are heading towards more consolidated democracy are also going through a period of economic growth, which has, of course, a climate impact. But still, I think we can, from other reasons, there are other factors that make us believe that democracy, or the backsliding of democracy, is not particularly good for climate policy outputs, especially as the backsliding of democracy, the face of it is the search of the far-right populists, which has become a political force that has focused very much on questioning science in general, but climate policy and climate science in particular. We can see these narratives have also, the narratives of these parties have aligned with disinformation campaigns spread by Russian troll factories and fossil fuel industry, foremost in United States. And we can also see, for instance, when it comes to Trump, is of course the politicians that we often refer to here, where we can see a very clear shift in the climate policy of the United States, and I don't need to go into details because that's not my topic here. But basically, if this is the policy approach to climate in general, and if the backsliding in democracy will produce more types of politicians of this character, then I think it's going to be difficult to push emissions down to the levels where we can have a more stable planetary system. But if we go back to the issue that I've started with, whether climate change is a challenge to democracy, well, you can simply put, you could look at certain implications of, say, the impacts of extreme weather events and their social economic consequences, and of course you can make the argument that these events have implications that are not particularly good for the sort of the fundamental prerequisites for stable democratic development. However, it is of course difficult if you going to isolate specific consequences of climate change and claim that these that these are directly affecting aspects like economic recession or public health crises, and that these will translate into a democratic decline. I mean, since these are different aspects, of course, associated with other political and social trends. So, and also I would say, when we look at natural sciences, become much better in identifying with attribution science how much a specific event is associated with climate change in particular. I think in social science we have not really started to focus and understand how the agency of nature is affecting social change in general. But I'm trying to make some kind of attempt in this book to look at different climate consequences and how they affect political development in general, but also democracy in particular. And of course, it's become a bit easier since these climate disasters are becoming more frequent, so we have more evidence to draw some conclusions from. We can also look at historic events like the San Simon hurricane, of course. But generally, it seems to be the case that the social impact of these events can create aspects that are not particularly good for democratic stability, like institutional breakdowns, or events that can be exploited by autocratic leaders. Similar events like the San Simon case was the Mozambique election in 2019 that occurred just after Hurricane Kenneth and Ida, that the ruling Frelimo party used to manipulated election for their favor. There are also some studies that have compared the political effects of specific climate disaster. In this study from researcher from the University of Durham, they looked at island states and the effect disasters had, exploring the political polity democracy index, and showing that disasters basically have a negative leading to democratic decline on 4.25% after the year directly after a hurricane. There are also several these kind of specific studies that could see that we can see increased corruption, contested elections, even increased political violence. Many of these studies, of course, focus on a specific set of countries, like low-income countries or unstable, non-democratic countries. Of course, beside these specific extreme weather events, a more concerning aspect of climate change is, of course, food production, which we know will be affected quite severely by climate change. The price of food in democracy research has not been like a factor that we looked so very deeply on. Of course, the food crisis have historically been a factor that caused political instability. But when we look at over this time between 1960 to the beginning of the end of the 1990s, food prices fell quite dramatically, and this was concurring with the third wave of democracy, while we've seen over the last couple of years a quite drastic increase of food prices. And we know that these spikes in food prices are having quite of an impact on political instability. So this is a study that counted the number of food riots in different countries. And the first one here was during the financial crisis, and the second one during the Arab revolt. And the Arab revolution was, or the Arab Spring, is of course a case that many some climate scientists are claiming that it was one of the first sort of like typical climate-affected crisis. So what actually happened, here we have a picture from Sidi Bouzid in Tunisia and one from Russia. So what happened in that year, or the year before the Arab Spring, in the end of the summer of 2010, we had heat records in Russia and Ukraine. So we basically, this is like one of the bread baskets, of course, of Europe, where producing quite a lot of wheat and being a major exporter of food around the world. So what happened was that the wheat harvest decreased quite drastically in Russia, also in Ukraine. This caused some kind of nervous reaction within the Russian administration, so they imposed an export ban. But this coincided with not as drastically poor harvest, but at least poor harvest in Canada, Australia, and also China. And a factor that although these factors could of course lead to increase of food prices, what was particularly severe here was that China, is the number one importer of wheat, started to purchase wheat on the global market because they were afraid that they will run out and that would cause political instability in China. And that caused the wheat prices to triple over autumn of 2010. At the same time, if we go to North Africa, this is a country that cannot produce enough food to sustain the needs of their own population, partly because water scarcity, poor agricultural methods that are depleting the agricultural soil and population growth. So these countries are also major importer of food. Egypt is behind China, the second largest, and was at that time as well. So people are spending quite a lot of the median income on food, and Egypt is trying to sort of mitigate that situation by spending a lot of their GNP on food subsidies. At the time of the Arab Spring, it was 3%. Now it's up to almost 5%. At the same time, you have these countries where corruption is quite ripe. There's abuse of power. Democracy is either absent or poor. Police violence, poverty, and unemployment, together with soaring food prices. And there are many scientists who says that food prices, there's something specific with with food because it's basically a sort of like an unnegotiable aspect of life. I mean, you can perhaps live with factors like unemployment or corruption, but food is something that basically comes down to the dinner table, and it's something that you cannot really avoid taking into consideration when you in life, and especially in situations where you have countries with high inequality. Food also becomes a insecurity becomes a factor that puts that sort of like highlights other types of inequalities, that makes it very combustible, of course, for political stability. The problem is, of course, that these events, like the what happened in 2010 and 2011, is of course likely to occur with global warming increasing. There's quite a lot of different studies trying to estimate how much food production would be impacted by different scenarios of heating, and it's difficult to say whether, because there's so much uncertainty in these studies, because it's difficult to say how much production will be impacted, if there are new types of food production methods will be developed, and so on. And we can see from this map that some countries will even be able to produce more food than others, but generally one of the most cited studies claim that about a third of the current crop and livestock production will be affected by 2080, depending on, of course, what kind of warmings we will have. Under 1.5 scenario, this will be lower. 1.5 is unfortunately not something that we can reach under currently. This is this trend is, of course, one of the most difficult, or the aspect of climate change that I would say will have the largest impact on democracies. And we know from studies that food insecurity in low-income countries is having a very negative impact on democratic development. However, if you look at the Arab Spring, you could of course say that the result of the Arab Spring eventually, from a democratic perspective, was negative, except from perhaps in Tunisia, where they've managed to topple the autocratic regime and move towards democracy, although it was a very fragile situation. But you could still say that these events had kind of like different outcomes, and I think we shouldn't exclude that these social impacts can also, or the social unrest, that the social impacts of climate extreme events, that they can also have, they can also open up for a scenario towards democratization. Colleagues of mine in Gothenburg did, or published in the beginning of this year, a big study on climate extreme events and looking at a big database on climate extreme events and correlated with the VDEM indexes, and they could actually see that in the years after, if you look at the full picture of climate extreme events, they could see that some aspects of democracy, for instance, media freedom, political party bans, and civil society restrictions moved towards a more positive direction. So basically saying that what's happened is that you open up a situation where you will have, maybe not intentional, but some kind of like situation where democracy improves in the years directly after extreme events. And why is this? And this is also shown in some other studies. So what happens, of course, what can happen, and in many cases when you have some type of disaster occurring, is that you could have some kind of power vacuum. You could, of course, have situation like the San Zeman, where you had authority that could grasp control, but often in these situations you might have the opposite effect. There's a lot of cases like this. For instance, one of the worst hurricanes ever struck was the Bola hurricane in East Pakistan in 1970, that completely changed the trajectory of Bangladesh, because it became this situation where the opposition movement, the Alawi League, stepped in, organized a lot of like the relief efforts at the local level. They saw to it that, or they connected with the grassroots movements that acted to help people in need, and they politicized the disaster, and they used it to build up the fight against Islamabad. At that time, the East Pakistan and proper Pakistan was one country, and eventually Bangladesh gained independence. But we can also see that many of these disasters are both mobilizing and consolidating effects. And there are some studies showing this. For instance, in Pakistan had one of the worst flooding disasters in 2010. They had another one in 2022, flooded almost a third of the country. There's an interesting study that looked at political participation in different parts of the countries, and they could see that in areas of the countries that were affected by the flood, or worst affected by the flood, you could actually see that there were some positive outcomes. And the conclusion was that in many local areas, you could see that the civil society became engaged, people were mobilized in these activities, and that mobilization translated into some democratic effects, that these organizations could later on become politicized and be a sort of a factor of raising people's political awareness. You could also see similar events in Puerto Rico, where some of the opposition forces against or some of the opposition parties have direct connections with some of the civil society organizations that were that pumped up or sprang up after Hurricane Maria. Of course, there's these events might put a political sort of development in different direction depending on the institutional situation or the social economic situation at the country. And of course, it's not first of all the disaster, the natural disaster, that is the determinant of that development, but is rather how the disaster sort of interacts with the social, economic, and political aspects before the disaster. And what we can see is, of course, that perceptions of justice becomes extremely important. How the event is seen, whether the relief efforts are fair or not, but also that the event as such becomes sort of a lens that sort of make people aware, or they put sort of they highlight the existing or the pre-existing injustice in society. And what we do know is that many of these events do lead to increased inequality in countries. We often talk about the poverty environment trap, but in the climate aspects, as researchers are starting to talk about the climate poverty trap. And there are a couple of studies showing that countries that are the most vulnerable countries have over the years seen a trend towards increasing inequality as a result of climate consequences, not only disasters as such, but also because agricultural production has become more difficult in several of these countries. Although these effects are only evident in low-income countries, not in high-income countries. But if this is the case, of course, this type of climate poverty trap, where people become marginalized after disaster, that could of course be a situation that sort of brings a perception or feeling of unfairness to society, which could act as a sort of a mobilizer for social social movements. And this is, while a lot of the studies here where these kind of inequalities are highlighted are focusing on low-income countries, we can probably expect that similar situations will occur in high-income countries as well, knowing that that the cost or the economic cost of climate change is increasing dramatically. These are figures of insurance transfers in the United States. So the numbers of incidents resulting in transfer for more than $1 billion have tripled since the 1980s to the last couple of years, 2023 here. But at the same time, we can also see that these, when people are affected by extreme events, their pre-existing economic or the economic resources they have prior to the event is very much a factor that affects how much impoverished they will be after the disasters. And we can see from this study that also sort of relief efforts from authorities, of course, connected with political decisions. And in the US, there's some researchers claiming that discriminatory factors are interacting with these decisions, making inequalities between especially white and black communities becoming even deeper. And this conversation about climate disasters being a factor that deepens inequalities or discriminatory structures is of course something that was very much highlighted by Hurricane Katrina, where we can see from this Pew research that the understanding of the government response was extremely divided between black and white communities. Partly because the government response was actually very divided in the sense that black areas which were predominantly black received less support after the hurricane, but also because the narrative around the hurricane was of course different in different communities. So the question is, if these situations are these disasters actually something that can cause grievances, that can either spur climate engagement or other types of social movements? Well, there are some researchers that claim that we'll have these type of events becoming more frequent. They will become a factor that would mobilize people for the course of perhaps both the climate transition, but also for addressing social injustices. I would say that that kind of scenarios, we shouldn't hope too much for it, although it is theoretically likely. I think if we see from research in especially US, but also from Europe, we can see that the understanding of disasters is very different in different communities depending on their political leaning. Wildfires, for instance, there's a couple of research studies on wildfires showing that people that normally vote for Republicans, they attribute wildfire incidents not so much to climate change, but rather to poor forest management or other aspects, while people the voters that normally vote for Democrats become more concerned about climate change and attribute it to climate change. Of course, this is also This is, of course, a factor, an effect that's caused by the political polarization of the country and the motivated reasoning that becomes effect of that, but also because the battle of the narrative, because of the disinformation that is spread over social media. For instance, a famous quote from Margaret Taylor Greene, where she claimed that Hurricane Helena was basically a man-made disaster created by the Democrats. But this is not only like a US case. We can see here from a study that looked at the media description of wildfires in Greece, where the different narratives were estimated. So most of the media discussions about the fires was that there's not a blame narrative at all. But even in this study, they show that even migrants' activities were the second most common factor, while government mismanagement and climate change was on the fourth fact. And this, of course, you could say that this is something caused by like ill-willing or political agents wanting to distract people. But there is also psychological factors in play. People tend to want to have a sort of a physical villain, someone to blame for events that are affecting them directly. And in these cases, government mismanagement is, of course, something that is easy at hand. But I think if we are going to say something about how these more frequent and severe disasters would affect the political development, we have to understand how they are described and how the narratives of these events are manufactured, because that will basically that will determine their impact on democracy in general and political the political development. And of course, Greta with her yellow raincoat was sort of like a hopeful character for the climate movement, but at the same time, yellow vests have changed the whole narrative for climate policy being something very cost effective, and I think we are seeing some kind of divisions when it comes to the description of disaster events around the world as well. Just take, for instance, the food inflation crisis. We have one upcoming political figure and one president basically exploiting these events politically, but with a completely different ideological positions. Whether any of these, whether Mondani can present aspect that would vitalize democracy remains to be seen, but still we cannot say that these events will automatically be negative for democratic development. It very much depends on what kind of political agents that can exploit them and use them for their own cause. With this slide, I'll wrap up. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We're entering the question period, and as usual, we have an audience online, even though we don't see it as usual, because it's only going to be there. Quite a lot of people. So you who are attending in person, put up your hand if you want to raise a question. And if you want to have a follow-up, just put up a finger. And if you're online, use the Zoom's chat to send in your question. And write your name and your what area you're in. We'd like to file questions from different disciplines. And you can write follow-up if you want to follow up somebody, and you write a name you're follow up to Gustav, for example. And for use online, we will put you up on the screen. Then we have questions here with a new system. So yes, we are going to start with a political scientist by name Bo Rothstein, I think. Right, microphone.
Thank you very much. Utterly interesting and convincing. However, two questions. What would happen if you compare to other major crises, like losing a war? Denmark losing a number of wars, Sweden losing a big war in the 19th century, that seems to have a positive effect on liberalization and democratization. Not to mention, of course, Germany and Japan. Special cases, but what would happen if you would compare? The other is more a comment. With all respect for the Widom Institute annual reports, if you look at them, there is a very strange thing, namely that the four co-principals, Michael Koppich, John Gehring, Jan Theorell, and Karl-Henrik Knudsen, utterly established democracy research. They write comments to the last two reports, saying that the report are exaggerating in an alarmist way the decline of democracy. I'm not a specialist in this, but I think one should be a little careful with Widom measures here, because they are utterly sensible to how you categorize countries. For example, in the 2004 report, they suddenly defined Canada as not a full democracy. So be a little careful with the Widom measure here, because it's driven by basically one person, Staffan Lindberg, and he is a little alarmist, I think.
Okay, thank you. I think the first question I mean, comparing with a war. Okay, you have, and I think it could be. I mean, it might not be such a different situation. I mean, what the case with disaster? Why it's difficult to make any certain claims of what kind of outcomes will come after a disaster is because of, I mean, we know that these hurricanes, floods will happen more frequently. But of course, we don't know when they'll strike, and it's often like a sort of a situation where the political situation in the country becomes shaken by surprise. And I think these situations often, I mean, you can't the government or the leading, say if it's a non-democratic country, the political forces can of course not plan if they're going to use it, exploit it. It's easier if you have a command over the situation. So what they can do is, of course, create a situation where the whole political or the power structures in the country is restructured or renegotiated very rapidly. And they can, in that case, open up a window for, I mean, first of all, new organizations to emerge, or new movements to emerge, or new organizations transform and take a new role. And I think that could, of course, be both very positive for democratic development, but it could also be negative. But basically, we have to understand that this sort of turbulence will become sort of like how would I say, sort of a random a factor that would sort of randomly shake development in different situations. And if these disasters are very severe, of course, they could lead to sort of a break with the development that's been, like a war, for instance, and start from here. The problem is, of course, that the war comes back again. So in countries with weak institutions or poor economic development, they tend to enter into this sort of like vicious circle. We've seen that from island states, for instance. You have a hurricane strike. You will need to reconstruct. You need to raise interest from international capital markets, and it will be more difficult for you to receive that kind of capital. You will be brought into this vicious circle where it's very difficult to build up the institution again. And I think that speaks for sort of a negative development in the long run, unfortunately. When it comes to the Widom, I think it's I don't know. I mean, it's difficult for me to comment. I think Marina and who did this study, she didn't use. I mean, they picked a couple of aspects within the index is quite. I mean, it's very broad. You can if you take the whole VDEM, maybe you can make that claim. But I think some of the data, as far as I understood, is valid. But that's a whole different discussion. I would love to have after this presentation. Yep. Thanks.
Yeah. So are you happy with that, Bo? Then I will do a follow-up, of course. I have a kind of similar worry about VDEM and how you use that data. I mean, when you're mapping this kind of against development in the degree of democracy, many of these measures seem to be mostly focused on what you call the input side, free and fair elections and things like that. Maybe even, so to say, making decisions about laws. But of course, we're interested also in the implementation. That came up a little bit, I thought, but maybe we had this, when you looked at actually emissions, there wasn't so big of a change or advantage for democracies.
No.
And you ascribe that to the fact that they were growing. But we also have another problem called, that Bo knows about, called corruption, which means that things are not implemented. And since they, for analytical reasons, separate this quite a lot of VDEM, I'm not sure if this kind of mapping is the most interesting.
No, I mean, corruption is interesting factor. Now, Marina, again, for a dissertation, she did a different study where she did map. She did one of the best studies, I would say, most solid studies on this. And her data found with VDEM that democracies are generally cleaner, so emissions have gone down in democracies. But if you once you look at corruption, that correlation doesn't hold. So corruption, in her study, corruption was the factor that basically makes democracy. It doesn't say that democracies are poorer, but the case for democracy is not that strong when you factor in the corruption.
So might it be that it's better to look at the degree of corruption?
Yeah, why not?
So it's really just maybe democracy thing is just an artifact of whether the corruption is more or less. I know you say that. I'm being a bit nice
and also when it comes to the effects of extreme weather events, you could see the corruption is also a matter. There's at least 2 studies showing that whether there's high corruption or low corruption, that's basically the determining factor whether the political development will, or the development of democracy will be more poor or at least remain in a stable situation.
So then it comes a little bit tricky how to evaluate this when you were talking about the degree of democracy.
Depends.
Corruption is behind there, and we wonder if that is the kind of factor that's really interesting here.
It is definitely. Yeah.
And I guess also, just to add a little thing, that maybe this kind of environmental catastrophe will increase the corruption after they happen. And that's why you want to have a strong man.
Yes, and now, Rahman, the study that showed that corruption increases also shows that people are more willing to accept restrictions in democracy just after a disaster, but they are not accepting increased corruption.
Okay.
So that's yes, of course. I think definitely corrupt. But then you can say, is corruption as a factor that is completely disconnected to the discussion of democracy? The corruption is very connected to the strength of institutions and whether they act according to the rule of law.
I think so, but most measures seem to focus on the input side rather than the delivery side.
Yeah, sure.
And that's a problem.
Yeah,
and
true.
Many of those VDEM things are like that. No, okay.
Yep.
I'm not gonna go on. Eva. Well, you were here on my list. Is there another Eva? You're on the list. Okay, and then we have Tim.
Yeah, thanks. So in the Freedom House report that you referred to, quite a few countries, not the majority that they looked at, but quite a few had improved scores on freedom. And if I'm not mistaken, quite a few of those countries over the same period that they got freer, according to Freedom House, experienced droughts, floods, storm, and on the other hand, a lot of countries where freedom declined plausibly didn't feel the same level of climate impacts. Now, I'm not raising that to kind of challenge your overall thesis, but you did raise the question, can democracy withstand the climate crisis? And it might be useful, in addition to saying, like, we have to cut emissions and increase food security, to sort of disaggregate the data that you presented at the beginning, which shows an overall trend, emissions increasing, and kind of an overall trend from the Freedom House report of countries getting less free. Disaggregate that and look at particular cases, because if we can look at the countries that have experienced climate impacts but have nevertheless, according to Freedom House, gotten freer, maybe there are some lessons in there. Maybe there are some specific details about the institutions in those countries, or something that could give us a clue about, what makes a country more resilient, or a democracy more resilient in the face of climate change.
Mm. Yeah, no, yeah, you got a point. I mean, and that's the claim I'm making. I mean, it's very. I mean, a simple understanding would be that these events would definitely lead to deterioration of democratic standards, but evidence doesn't really support that. It's very fractured, and I guess I mean there are, as I said, studies identifying such factors: the strength of the institution, corruption, economic strength, of course, are such factors. And I think if there's something you can generally say, that maybe these I mean, climate change is the impact of climate change is very uneven across the world, and will be, but also the impact on governance.
Yeah, but there's a big caveat here, which is that I'm just taking the Freedom House, scoring at face value, and as Bo pointed out, maybe that's not. I mean, just as there may be cases where Freedom House says something that sounds absurd, like Canada went from a full democracy to not a full democracy, there could be, opposite cases where it says that a country improved democratically, but that might be questionable. So, yeah, caveat.
Yeah.
Very good. So then we have Andreas do it, I hope.
Okay, thank you very much for a very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. I have two questions. One follows a little bit on what's already been said, but I think this is an important initiative to disentangle, and if you want to get to the bottom of this. And it seems to me that I wonder if democracy is really the key operating thing here. I wonder if it's not more a story more about state capacity or lack of state capacity, or regime strength or anything like that. It seems to me that it's not really where it's democracy or autocracy that's the moving part here, but really to what extent weaker regimes are more likely to experience regime change when hit by some sort of climate shock or something like that. And then it can go either way. They can become more autocratic, or they can become more democratic, or move from autocratic to democratic. But the key thing is not really democracy. It's whether the state is strong or weak. Because, I mean, it's very unlikely to envision a scenario where Finland would experience a regime change as a consequence of a large weather anomaly or climate anomaly. And the same thing in China. I don't think they're going to change their mode of governance just because they're getting hit by a tropical storm or whatever, right? So it really matters how strong the government is for the causal narrative that you're trying to paint here, I would guess. And then my second question is, well, how big is the effect of climate change? Say there is an effect. How big is that compared to other drivers of democratization and autocratization that are also in play? This is not the only thing that causes regime change. There are many other things as well. So I think it's important to get a sense of how important climate change is in relation to other factors that might cause changes.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I agree when looking at the overall picture that the strength of the regime is, of course, important. However, I would say if you look at some of these cases, I mean, what I'm interested in here is to see that there is a general conception that you'll have climate consequences, and that will lead to erosion of trust or pacification of social activities, or however, it doesn't seem to be the case. It seems to be some of these events seems to trigger some kind of mobilization or some kind of social activities, political activities, regardless if that's in a democracy or in autocratic states, and that these kinds of activities could have they could vitalize democracy, but they could also lead to sort of political instability. So I think you need to, of course, look at both those factors, of course, and secondly, I've tried to make it quite clear that it's very difficult to. I mean, you have some kind of natural disasters that interacts, of course, with different. I mean, political situation in the country, the economic. So can we isolate the effect of climate consequences? I don't think we. I mean, you could in some cases, perhaps. But what I'm saying is that we haven't. I mean, there's now starting to become. I mean, I'm seeing some studies that looks at this, but I think we need to be aware that this is the future we are facing. We are entering into a more turbulent time. We're going to have more types of disasters like this. So the factor of, I mean, nature as an agent, not with a specific agency, but as an agent of social change, will become more important if we're going to understand how political development in different countries will develop. And I think it's we need to pay attention to that and understand that. And I think there's a lot of research needs to be done here, and I think there's a lot of things that we need to start to understand. And there's also maybe we haven't been able to do that research because we've only have a couple of like disaster events. A lot of these research are, of course, looking at even earthquakes, which are, of course, not connected to climate change, but there's still. You could still draw some lessons because they might be similar type of like social shocks. So I'm not saying that I have direct answers for you, but I'm saying that this is something that I think that the fact of climate change will have a greater influence in these interactions.
Very good. So the gentleman next, Andrea.
I'm Ernst Hollander, and political economist, interested in Polanyian analysis. I think it's extremely important illuminating what you said, and also read your earlier book, this Upphettning. And I thought when reading this and listening to you now that I don't know if you ventured in changing the causality, the line of causation. I would argue or suggest arguing that one could start. Okay, hello. That you could start with going away from embedded liberalism or the financialization, neoliberalism, away from this embedded liberalism of the period. And for the Western democracies, at least, one could argue that this development leads to less social coherence, more corruption, less trust, etc. And that in turn leads to weaker climate policies. And so I think what you're seeing now in COP30 and so on and around the globe with a dismantling of the climate advances of the last years and very much so in Sweden. So did you explore this line of causation? Because now you're very much starting with nature and going into, but I think that would be very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, in this book, I've very much focused on this specific topic of how climate impacts. But of course, and I think the development that we see now with like a climate policy backlash in the US and Europe, it's I think it's connected to something quite different. Maybe the explanation that you're presenting is better to describe what's happening with. But I also think that the way we understand how these things are developing is very narrow. We're just looking at Europe and the US. I mean, in the Asia, we have a completely different policy development when it comes to investments in clean energy and so on. And maybe it's too early to say if this is a bump in the road and we'll have a shift over towards more consolidated climate policies in a couple of years. I don't know. I mean, what we do know is, of course, that beside politics, we have a trend where the fossil fuel industry, where some countries are, I mean, fossil fuel industry is sort of like threatened by the transition, of course, and feeding a lot of resources into these political movements that are connected with the far rights like Trump and so on. So I think that's of course a factor that's really plays into discussion of what you're raising now.
Wait for the microphone, though. You can have a follow-up. But do you have the microphone? Use it.
Yeah, I think you argued a bit along my lines in this Upphettning. I mean, you could argue also that, for instance, this fossil fuel subsidies and a lot of other things where conservative or vested interests are winning are very much aided by corruption, and corruption is very much aided by going down of democracy. So I think one could argue quite forcefully, and of course I hope that there will be a reversal and it's just a bump in the road. But also the critics of VDEM said the same thing, that this is just a bump in the road. I'm afraid that the climate crisis is so urgent that we don't, as a civilization, have time to have too many bumps in the road, in this road. So I think it's extremely severe, and I think the only, or at least one should explore that strengthening of democracy is a prerequisite for also strengthening climate work, etc., and getting people to trust each other, etc. Okay.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the bump in the road might mean, I don't know, not 2.8, but I mean 2.6 and 2. So it's a bump in the road is very serious in this situation of urgency, of course.
And a lot of tipping points that might.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so then next Felicia, sitting somewhere.
I had one question that I think kind of already been asked, so I will ask another one that maybe is not so good, but I will try. I was wondering a little bit, like the general definition of sustainability, or like what is of a sustainable state, or a state that is moving towards sustainability, is that emissions are being reduced, and that is connected to democracy in your case here. But I think like a very easy contradiction to that would be that many authoritarian states, like you said, are also developing nations and have per capita way lower emissions, and asking them to reduce to the same extent their emissions have a lot of environmental justice implications and so on. So I was wondering just how you thought about this in this project, or like working with these numbers. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this case of like climate injustice, where developing nations are constantly saying, no, you can't put the same, or you can't ask the same, have the same request from us to lower our emissions because we need to develop. I think that argument is becoming weaker, because a lot of the I mean, first of all, the some of the investments that need to be done are scaled up right now is of course China investing in developing world on a lot of renewable energy, and even like rolling out electric cars. You can discuss whether that's the full solution to the problem, but I think the possibilities of decoupling has improved. Still, if you look at the states that have fully decoupled, so basically been able to have economic growth without increasing the climate impact, those are only full democracies, which of course is perhaps a case for democracy, but these are only a handful of countries, so you can't make maybe any general conclusions of that. But I think the creation of climate injustice in that aspect is starting to change. On the other hand, I think what needs to be, and what the conversation is very much about now with the last couple of COPs, is of course on climate adjustments, because adaptation, which I think is I mean, the nations that have emitted the least are the nations that are impacted the most, where there's the most scant resources to adjust, and this is of course not becoming in the forefront of the general discussion around the world.
Very good. So then we have a question from the online audience, Malcolm Fairbrother. But you see Kari's iPhone coming up instead of Malcolm.
What? Sorry?
Yeah, now. Good, Malcolm.
Oh, okay.
You're online. We can see you.
Hi. Thanks, Daniel. That was very thought-provoking. You're making quite a big claim. I mean, it's not a small thing that you're trying to prove. And I have to say, I'm not persuaded. I'm not persuaded that you're wrong, but I'm not persuaded. I don't think you provided enough evidence yet to kind of prove the thesis. But you may end up being correct. But I don't know. I don't think we'll know for like 50 years.
That's a bit too late.
I have yeah, it is too late. That's part of the problem. I have a couple follow-ups to things that have sort of been said before. I liked Boo's point about comparisons with other disasters. And my general feeling about this is disasters undermine regimes insofar as the regime is, embarrassingly bad at dealing with them. So I think that could apply to a lot of different kinds of things. One idiosyncratic one that I know about, because I, used to study Mexico, was Mexico had a big earthquake, a couple of earthquakes in the mid-1980s. And the then authoritarian regime was just so pathetically bad at helping people kind of deal with them, that it was the start of a sort of civil mobilization, because people just sort of had to dig themselves out of rubble. And that was one of the factors that I think is generally regarded as the beginning of the end of 70 years of authoritarianism in Mexico. So insofar as authoritarian regimes prove incompetent at handling climate change or related disasters, I think that could basically break them down, and democracy could sort of, spring out of the rubble of various sorts of disasters linked to climate change. So could it undermine democracy? Yes, if democratic governments are bad at handling it. But I think the opposite could also happen. And then my second comment, you had a slide with Trump, Okeson, and Farage, and I think you were making the point that the sort of forces they represent threaten both democracy and progress on climate change. And in a sense, my reaction to that is, well, two of them are failing or have failed. I mean, Sweden and the UK are two countries that have actually done pretty well in reducing emissions. I mean, emissions from these countries have come down a lot. Okay, Trump is succeeding, but frankly, I don't think it's about democracy. I think it's about fossil fuels. So, the UK and Sweden in particular have basically never had big fossil fuel industries, some caveats about the UK and North Sea and so on. Whereas Trump presides over, the fossil fuel behemoth. And then if you compare with other countries, well, Canada, where I'm originally from, and Australia, don't really have a lot of this sort of nationalist populism, but they are complete embarrassments on climate change with very high emissions that are basically not going down. So I'm not sure that your focus on that sort of political force is actually very strong evidence for your thesis at this point. But I'm interested to hear what you think about my challenge to your argument in that area.
Thanks, Malcolm. First of all, I'm saying that I'm making this claim, and I'm saying that the picture is much more complex. So that's basically my answer to it. I mean, Mexico. I've discussed Mexico in the book. I would say, was Mexico the situation after the earthquake in Mexico was because that helped, of course, democratization of Mexico. Scientists claims that events managed to consolidate the opposition, and they've managed to oust at least the government of Mexico City, or the authority of Mexico City, and it helped. But the question is, was that because the Mexican government was so poor, or was that because the event helped the opposition forces to find grounds to mobilize and to produce something positive? You can do a comparison. There was an earthquake in Guatemala just a few years before Mexico, where you had similar situation, not effective response of the government. Guatemala never democratized, and there are different factors in play in both of these situations. So what I'm saying that the events were extremely important for the political development in both of countries, and also the development of the institutional structure, governance structure, and democracy. But they had different outcomes depending on the various factors. But what's important is, of course, that the disaster events was triggering something. Secondly, I would say, okay, so you compare. Actually, if you look at Åkesson, I think if you look at the Swedish case, so in 2021, EPA, the Environment Protection Agency in Sweden, had the scenarios of Sweden emission. Swedish emission to steadily go down to 26. Now, with this government, they've increased with 14 CO ton equivalents annually, which makes Sweden now, with, I guess, influence of partly Åkesson and the other parties being very accompanying with the sort of counter climate policies of that party, have led to Sweden shifting from becoming now going in the climate policy performance index, which is one of those indexes on measuring climate policies of different countries. So Sweden was in 2021 the highest ranked country. This week, the new report came out, and Sweden have fallen down to position 13. So we've fallen down quite extensively. We will keep on falling if I guess if this political force keeps on having an influence of the party. Nigel Farage, of course, you can't say very much on him because he hasn't been. I mean, maybe indirectly had some influence over UK policies, but the UK government is quite ambitious right now, especially with energy policies. But if the government falls, Farage actually has a quite good chance of assuming power in UK, which no one believed in a couple of years ago. I think we will have similar policy backlash as we've seen in the US and Sweden. I think US and Sweden are quite similar in the climate policy backlashes. And the cuts of environmental budget in US and Sweden, on percentage, they're almost exactly the same. So Sweden is actually one of the worst cases of climate policy backlashes. We are still relying on our past merits of being a climate policy leader, but right now we going heading towards a more less ambitious position.
Okay, on that note, join me and thank you, Daniel, for this very interesting talk.
Thank you.
We have some more talks coming up on November 26th. We have Natushka Lee on Mars and Earthlings, a realistic view on Mars exploration and settlement. And she is a micro and astrobiologist from the Swedish University of Agricultural Science. And then December 3rd, we have Olle Norheim from Harvard. He's going to talk about halving premature death by 2050, ethical issues. And then finishing off the term, perhaps fitting, Sofia Jeppsson is going to talk about on December 10th, the same day as the Nobel festivities, philosophy of madness and lived experience. You're very welcome, Dan. Thank you.